On March 17, 1982, when spring's warmth began to reveal the secrets that the harsh winter had hidden in the rolling hills of the Ozark Mountains in Missouri, assistant social worker Margaret Wilson made her way down a treacherous dirt road toward an isolated cabin deep within Shannon County. What she would discover that day would forever change her understanding of the limits of social isolation and the devastating consequences of institutional neglect in America's forgotten rural communities. The journey itself was a testament to the family's isolation, 27 kilometers from the nearest town of Current River, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that became completely impassable during spring rains and winter storms, effectively cutting off the inhabitants from the outside world for months at a time. Margaret's visit had been prompted by an anonymous complaint received by the Missouri Department of Social Services, alleging that children were living in deplorable conditions and possibly suffering abuse. The caller had provided few details, but the urgency in their voice had been enough to warrant an investigation. As Margaret navigated the final stretch of the muddy road, her car struggling against the soft earth left behind by the recent spring thaw, she could not have imagined the complex web of isolation, manipulation, and generational dysfunction she was about to uncover. The property that came into view was a testament to both human resilience and tragic neglect. The main structure was a weathered log cabin, built by hand in the 1920s by Elijah Shelton's grandfather, a man who had sought to escape the encroaching modern world by carving out a life in these remote hills. The cabin consisted of just 4 rooms, 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen with a wood-burning stove, and a modest living area that served multiple purposes. Adjacent to the main dwelling stood a small barn that had seen better days, its roof sagging under decades of Missouri weather. A vegetable garden, still dormant from winter, stretched behind the house, and an old well provided the only source of water. There was no electricity, no telephone, no running water. The family lived as their ancestors had a century before. Upon her arrival, Margaret was greeted by Elijah Shelton, a man of 47 years whose appearance immediately struck her as both intimidating and oddly compelling. Of medium stature, with a graying beard that reached nearly to his chest, Elijah possessed piercing blue eyes that seemed to carry the weight of generations of mountain isolation. His clothes were clean but worn, handmade from heavy fabric that spoke of practical necessity rather than fashion. Behind him stood Martha Shelton, his 43-year-old sister, a woman whose once pretty features had been weathered by years of hard living and what Margaret would later recognize as profound psychological distress. Martha's hair, prematurely gray, was pulled back severely, and her clothes hung loosely on her thin frame. The climate that March day was mild, with temperatures reaching 17 degrees Celsius under partially cloudy skies. The recent thaw had left the ground around the cabin muddy and treacherous, and the air carried the characteristic smell of wet earth and decaying wood that permeates the Ozark Hills in early spring. It was in this setting that Margaret first encountered the 3 children who would become the center of one of Missouri's most disturbing criminal cases. Thomas, at 12 years old, was the eldest of the 3 children. Despite his youth, he carried himself with a maturity that seemed born of necessity rather than natural development. His right arm bore a prominent scar, badly healed, the result of an axe accident the previous year that had never received proper medical attention. Sadie, 9 years old, possessed the same striking blue eyes as the adults, but suffered from a noticeable strabismus that caused her left eye to turn inward, a condition that could have been easily corrected with proper medical care in early childhood. The youngest, Jacob, was 5 years old, but appeared significantly smaller and less developed than other children his age, showing clear signs of cognitive delays that would later prove to have devastating underlying causes. What immediately caught Margaret's trained eye, however, were the unmistakable physical similarities shared by all 5 inhabitants of the cabin. The children and adults shared the same intense blue eyes, the same distinctive facial bone structure, the same unusual ear shape, and the same particular way of holding their heads when listening. These were not merely the similarities one might expect in a family. They were the pronounced similarities that suggested something far more troubling. When Margaret gently inquired about the children's mother, Elijah hesitated for a long moment, his eyes darting toward Martha before responding that his wife had died during Jacob's difficult birth 5 years earlier. Martha remained completely silent during this exchange, avoiding eye contact with the social worker and seeming to shrink further into herself with each passing moment. It was in this moment that Margaret's professional instincts began to sound alarm bells, though she could not yet articulate exactly what felt so wrong about the family's dynamic. County records would later reveal the absence of any marriage certificate for Elijah Shelton. In fact, the only official documents that could be located were the birth certificates of Elijah and Martha, listing them as the children of Harold and Edith Shelton, and a land ownership record dating back to 1924, when Elijah's grandfather had first claimed the remote property. Most troubling of all, none of the three children possessed official birth certificates, effectively making them invisible to the outside world. The Shelton family's gradual descent into complete isolation had begun following the tragic death of Elijah and Martha's parents in a house fire in 1973. Harold and Edith Shelton had themselves been deeply suspicious of the outside world, raising their children with minimal contact with the broader community and instilling in them a profound distrust of government institutions, social services, and what Harold called the corrupting influence of modern society. After their deaths, Elijah and Martha had severed virtually all remaining ties with the local community, venturing into Current River only when absolutely necessary to purchase supplies they could not produce on their property. Local residents who remembered the family described Elijah as an increasingly paranoid and hostile man who seemed to view every interaction with suspicion. Store clerks recalled his brief, tense visits to purchase basic supplies, noting how he would count his money carefully, speak only when absolutely necessary, and seem eager to complete his business and return to his mountain sanctuary as quickly as possible. Several locals had noticed the striking physical similarities between the children who occasionally accompanied him, but in a region where large families and strong family resemblances were common, few had thought to question the situation more deeply. The first real suspicions that Martha might be the biological mother of the three children began to form in Margaret's mind as she observed the family's interactions throughout that first visit. There was something in the way 5-year-old Jacob instinctively sought comfort from Martha, clinging to her worn skirts when frightened by the presence of a stranger. She noticed how Martha seemed to anticipate each child's needs without a word being spoken, how her eyes followed their every movement with a protective intensity that went far beyond what one might expect from an aunt. Most telling was the look that passed between Martha and the children, a deep, unspoken bond that spoke of a relationship far more intimate than that of aunt and nephews and niece. The formal investigation into the Shelton family situation began on March 24, 1982, exactly 1 week after Margaret Wilson's disturbing initial visit. The Missouri Department of Social Services, working in coordination with the Shannon County Sheriff's Department, assembled a small but specialized team to conduct a more thorough evaluation of the family's circumstances. The team consisted of Margaret, who had already established the initial contact with the family, Sheriff's Deputy David Tanner, an experienced officer known for his ability to handle sensitive situations involving children, and Dr. Robert Hayes, a pediatrician from West Plains with experience in identifying signs of abuse and neglect. The team's return to the isolated property immediately encountered significant resistance from Elijah Shelton. When confronted with more direct questions about the children's origins, their medical care, and their education, Elijah became defensive and hostile, repeatedly asserting that the authorities had no right to interfere with what he termed our family business. His phrase, "we take care of our own," would be repeated multiple times throughout the interview, each repetition carrying an increasingly ominous undertone that would later prove to be loaded with disturbing meaning. Martha's behavior during this second visit was even more concerning than during the first. She responded to direct questions only with monosyllables, often looking to Elijah before speaking, and seemed to exist in a state of constant anxiety. Her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, and she flinched noticeably whenever anyone moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. The children, for their part, demonstrated a complex mixture of curiosity about the visitors and clear fear of their presence, clustering together and watching the adults with wide, uncertain eyes that suggested they had been warned about the dangers of talking to strangers. Dr. Hayes was able to conduct basic physical examinations of the three children, and his findings were deeply troubling. Beyond the mild malnutrition and complete lack of preventative medical care that Margaret had already noted, he observed several physical characteristics that could indicate genetic problems consistent with inbreeding. Thomas's extra finger on his left hand, a condition known as polydactyly, was just the most obvious sign. Sadie's dental development was severely abnormal, with several teeth growing in unusual positions and others failing to develop at all. Jacob presented the most serious concerns, with signs of cognitive impairment that appeared far more severe than initially perceived, along with subtle facial abnormalities that suggested possible genetic syndromes. As Dr. Hayes would later write in his official report, these signs, when observed in isolation, could have various innocent explanations. However, when observed together, combined with the pronounced physical similarities among all family members and the extreme social isolation, they raised serious concerns about possible consanguinity and its genetic consequences. The investigation took on new urgency when the team gained access to scattered medical records from hospitals in neighboring counties. The search revealed a disturbing pattern that had previously gone unnoticed due to the use of different names and the geographic spread of the medical visits. In 1970, a woman matching Martha's physical description and basic medical information had been treated at a hospital following what was described as a domestic accident. During that treatment, medical staff had noted that she was approximately 3 months pregnant. However, there was no subsequent record of a birth or adoption during the expected time frame. Further investigation revealed that this same woman, using various aliases but with consistent physical descriptions and medical details, had sought treatment at different hospitals in the region in 1970, 1973, and 1977 years that corresponded almost exactly to the approximate birth years of Thomas, Sadie, and Jacob. In each case, the woman had provided minimal information, paid in cash when possible, and left the hospital as soon as medically feasible, often against medical advice. The investigation encountered a significant obstacle when Elijah, sensing the direction of the inquiry, began to refuse entry to investigators and threaten legal action if they continued to harass his family. Without concrete evidence of abuse or severe neglect that would justify immediate intervention, the authorities found their options legally limited. Missouri law in 1982 required substantial evidence of immediate danger to children before social services could remove them from their home, and the genetic concerns, while troubling, did not meet the legal threshold for emergency action. It was at this crucial juncture that a witness emerged who would prove instrumental in advancing the case. Sarah Jenkins, an 83-year-old woman who lived approximately 5 kilometers from the Shelton property, contacted Margaret Wilson after hearing local rumors about the investigation. Sarah revealed that she had been a close friend of Edith Shelton, Elijah and Martha's mother, and had maintained sporadic contact with the family even after their parents' death and the family's subsequent isolation from the community. Sarah's testimony provided crucial historical context that helped investigators understand the generational patterns that had led to the current situation. Edith was always afraid that something terrible would happen, Sarah recalled during her lengthy interview with Margaret. Harold kept that family isolated from the time those children were small, telling them that the outside world was evil and corrupt, that they could only trust in their own blood. He used to say that mixing with outsiders would weaken the family line, that their children would be born cursed if they married outside the family. When Harold and Edith died in the house fire in 1973, Sarah had attempted to provide support and assistance to the grieving siblings. However, she found Elijah already deeply influenced by his father's paranoid worldview, suspicious and hostile toward any offers of help from the community. He was already talking like his father. Sarah remembered saying that outsiders wanted to break up the family, that they needed to stick together to survive. Sarah's most damaging testimony concerned a visit she had made to the cabin in 1971, approximately 2 years after the parents' death. During this visit, she had noticed that Martha was visibly pregnant, a fact that immediately struck her as odd, since she knew of no husband or boyfriend in Martha's life. When Sarah had gently inquired about the pregnancy, suggesting that Martha might need medical attention and support during her confinement, Elijah had flown into a rage, ordering Sarah to leave the property immediately and forbidding her from ever returning. "I should have done something at that time," Sarah lamented during her interview, tears streaming down her weathered face. "But who would have believed me? And where would those children have ended up? The system doesn't take good care of mountain folk like us." I told myself maybe there was some explanation I didn't understand, maybe there was a man I didn't know about. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. While Sarah's testimony provided important context and corroborated the timeline of suspected pregnancies, it was not sufficient legal evidence to justify intervention. The investigation team needed concrete proof to support their growing suspicions about the true nature of the relationship between Elijah and Martha, and the parentage of the 3 children. A significant breakthrough occurred when one of the investigators decided to examine more closely the birth records of Elijah and Martha themselves. This seemingly routine check revealed a disturbing detail that had been overlooked in earlier investigations. Harold and Edith Shelton, the parents of Elijah and Martha, had shared the same surname before their marriage. Subsequent genealogical research revealed that Harold and Edith were first cousins, both descendants of the same Shelton patriarch who had first settled in the Ozark Hills in the late 1800s. Local historian Dr. Elizabeth Warren, consulted by the investigation team, provided important context for this discovery. Marriages between close relatives were not uncommon in isolated mountain communities during the early decades of the 20th century, she explained. Geographic isolation meant that many families lived for generations without significant contact with outsiders. In some cases, marriages between cousins and even closer relatives became not just accepted, but expected as a way of keeping family property consolidated and bloodlines pure. What often began as practical necessity gradually became justified by distorted beliefs about genetic superiority and family loyalty. This revelation cast the current situation in an entirely new light. The investigation team began to develop a theory that what they were witnessing was not an isolated case of incest, but rather the continuation of a multi-generational pattern of inbreeding that had become deeply embedded in the family's belief system and way of life. Elijah and Martha, already genetically compromised by their parents, consanguineous marriage, and psychologically damaged by extreme isolation and indoctrination, may have simply continued a pattern they had been taught to see as normal and even desirable. The investigation received another boost when researchers located medical records from a Springfield hospital where a woman matching Martha's description had been treated in 1977 under the name Mary Smith. The record showed that she had been hospitalized in advanced labor and had given birth to a boy with multiple health complications, including respiratory problems and a mild cardiac defect. The birth date corresponded exactly with Jacob's estimated age, and the medical complications matched those that Dr. Hayes had observed during his examination. Most significantly, the medical team at Springfield had noted concerns about possible genetic abnormalities and had recommended additional testing, but Mary Smith had left the hospital against medical advice as soon as her condition and that of the baby had stabilized sufficiently for travel. The attending physician had noted in the record his frustration at being unable to provide proper follow-up care for what appeared to be a high-risk infant. While Jacob was recovering from a severe respiratory infection at West Plains Regional Medical Center in September 1982, an illness that had finally forced Elijah to seek outside medical help, despite his usual resistance, Dr. Michael Brennan, a genetic specialist who had been consulted on the case, was able to perform more comprehensive examinations with Elijah's reluctant consent. Dr. Brennan's findings were definitive and disturbing. Jacob's genetic profile revealed multiple subtle congenital anomalies that individually might have gone unnoticed, but together formed a clear pattern consistent with a high degree of consanguinity. The genetic markers we're observing here are typical of children born from relationships between first-degree relatives. Dr. Brennan informed the investigation team, "There's a level of homozygosity that would be excessive even for relationships between first cousins." During Jacob's 2-week hospitalization due to complications from pneumonia, Martha remained constantly at his bedside, displaying an intensity of maternal care and anxiety that made her true relationship to the child increasingly obvious to hospital staff. It was during this emotionally and physically exhausting period that Martha, worn down by years of psychological pressure and the immediate crisis of Jacob's illness, finally began to open up to Margaret Wilson. Late one night, while Jacob slept under the influence of medication, Martha began to share fragments of her story in a barely audible whisper. She spoke about the growing isolation following their parents' death, how Elijah had gradually assumed complete control over every aspect of their lives, and how the boundaries between normal family roles had slowly but inexorably begun to blur. "We didn't know anyone else," Martha confessed, her voice breaking with emotion. "Elijah said the outside world wanted to separate us, to hurt us. He said we could only trust each other, that our love was pure, because it wasn't contaminated by strangers. While Martha never explicitly admitted during this conversation to being the biological mother of the 3 children, her words and the raw emotion behind them made the situation increasingly clear to Margaret. The social worker, recognizing the fragility of the trust that was finally being established, carefully avoided asking direct questions about paternity, instead focusing on providing emotional support and creating a safe space for Martha to continue sharing her experiences. Meanwhile, the documentary investigation continued to yield important evidence. A significant advancement occurred when researchers located Reverend Samuel Miller, a traveling pastor who administered to isolated communities throughout the Ozark Hills during the 1960s and 1970s. Reverend Miller had kept detailed diaries of his visits, including careful observations about the families he encountered and their living conditions. An entry dated June 1969 provided the first contemporary outside perspective on the Shelton family dynamics. Visited the Shelton family today. The parents died recently under tragic circumstances, leaving 2 adult children, Elijah 34 and Martha 30. Found them living in extreme poverty and isolation. Offered spiritual and material assistance but was received with suspicion, particularly by young Elijah. Something about the dynamic between the siblings seemed troubling to me. Martha appeared submissive, almost fearful. Fear that without the moderating influence of their parents, isolationist as they were, the situation could deteriorate further. Intend to return, but confess I felt powerless to help. A later entry from April 1971 proved even more revealing and troubling. Returned to Shelton property after nearly 2 years. Was prevented from entering by Elijah, who seemed even more hostile and paranoid than before. From a distance, I could see Martha briefly. She appeared to be in advanced stages of pregnancy. When I mentioned this to Elijah, suggesting they might need medical attention, he became furious, accusing me of spreading lies and threatening to assault me if I did not leave immediately. Reported my concerns to the local sheriff, but was told that without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, nothing could be done. These mountains keep their secrets, and I fear some of them are too dark to bear the light of day. Reverend Miller's diary provided the first contemporary documentation of Martha's pregnancies, corroborating the timeline that investigators had constructed from medical records and witness testimony. More importantly, it demonstrated that concerns about the family situation had been raised by multiple individuals over the years, but had never been properly followed up by authorities. Based on the mounting evidence, Judge Elena Simmons issued a court order in October 1982 authorizing DNA testing of all members of the Shelton household. The results, obtained in November 1982, were conclusive and devastating. The genetic tests confirmed that Elijah was indeed the biological father of all 3 children, and Martha was their biological mother. The children's genetic profiles also revealed the expected consequences of such close inbreeding, including elevated risks for various genetic disorders and developmental problems. On December 7, 1982, based on the DNA evidence and the testimony that had been collected over the preceding months, Elijah Shelton was formally charged with incest, a Class D felony in Missouri punishable by up to 4 years in prison. Martha, considered a victim due to substantial evidence of prolonged psychological coercion and manipulation, did not face criminal charges, though her ability to properly care for the children became a subject of intense court scrutiny. The trial of Elijah Shelton began in February 1983 and quickly became one of the most complex and morally challenging cases in Shannon County's history. Despite efforts to maintain discretion and protect the privacy of the children involved, the case attracted significant regional media attention, with reporters from as far away as St. Louis and Kansas City traveling to the small mountain courthouse to cover the proceedings. Elijah's defense was handled by public defender Gerald Thompson, an experienced attorney who recognized the unique challenges presented by his client's case. Thompson's strategy centered on arguing that the extreme isolation and profoundly dysfunctional environment in which Elijah had been raised had fundamentally compromised his ability to understand basic social and moral norms. Thompson presented extensive evidence about the family's history of isolation, the consanguineous marriage of Elijah's parents, and the systematic indoctrination that had convinced Elijah that his actions were not only acceptable but necessary for the preservation of family purity. The defendant, Thompson argued in his opening statement, is himself the product of generations of isolation and quite possibly previous inbreeding. He is the son of first cousins who raised him to believe that the outside world was hostile and evil, that the family unit should remain completely self-contained. He was taught from childhood that mixing with outsiders would weaken and corrupt the family bloodline. In the defendant's mind, distorted as it was by years of isolation and indoctrination, his relationship with his sister was not a violation of natural law, but rather the fulfillment of family duty. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Amanda Lewis, acknowledged the unusual circumstances of the case, but maintained that Elijah had demonstrated sufficient understanding of social norms to recognize the wrongness of his actions. Lewis pointed out that Elijah had shown the ability to interact with the outside community when necessary, conducting business in town and carefully concealing the true nature of his relationship with Martha. These are not the actions of someone unable to distinguish right from wrong, Lewis argued. The defendant knew his behavior was unacceptable to society, which is why he went to such great lengths to hide it. The most crucial and emotionally difficult testimony came from Martha Shelton herself, who testified behind closed doors with only the judge, attorneys, and a court reporter present. Excerpts from her testimony, later made public in edited form, revealed a systematic pattern of psychological manipulation that had begun gradually after their parents' death when Martha was 29 and Elijah 33. According to Martha's testimony, Elijah had initially assumed the role of protective older brother following their parents' deaths, taking responsibility for managing the property and making decisions about their survival in isolation. However, over the course of several years, this protective role had gradually transformed into complete domination over every aspect of Martha's life. Elijah had systematically isolated her even further from the minimal outside contacts they had maintained, convincing her that the world beyond their property was filled with people who wanted to harm them and separate their family. "He told me we were special," Martha testified, her voice barely audible even in the small courtroom, "that our blood was pure, that our children would be strong because they wouldn't be contaminated by the outside world. At first I resisted, but after years alone with him, with no one else to talk to, I began to believe what he was telling me. He said that God had made us brother and sister so that we could create a pure family line, that it was our duty to continue our parents' work." The testimony revealed that Martha's first pregnancy had occurred in 1970, when she was 35, and had been living alone with Elijah for nearly 3 years. By that time, she was completely dependent on him for all contact with the outside world, and had been systematically convinced that their relationship was not only acceptable, but divinely ordained. Each subsequent pregnancy had been presented by Elijah as further proof of God's approval of their union and their special destiny as guardians of family purity. Dr. Richard Foster, a psychiatrist specializing in isolation-induced psychological disorders and abusive family dynamics, testified as an expert witness, explaining to the jury the profound effects of extreme social isolation and prolonged indoctrination. "What we observe in this case," Dr. Foster explained, "is a textbook example of an alternative reality constructed through isolation. When an individual is systematically cut off from all normative social references, their perception of what is acceptable and normal can be radically distorted. Add to this the pre-existing family belief system that elevated inbreeding as a form of genetic and spiritual purity, and you have a perfect storm for this type of psychological manipulation." The trial also served to highlight the systematic failures of local institutions to identify and intervene in the deteriorating situation. Evidence presented during the proceedings revealed that concerns about the Shelton family had been expressed by at least 3 different individuals over the course of more than a decade. Reverend Miller, neighbor Sarah Jenkins, and an employee at the Current River General Store who had noticed the unusual similarities between the children and adults who occasionally visited to purchase supplies. In each case, these concerns had been reported to local authorities but had never been properly investigated or followed up, revealing significant gaps in the systems meant to protect vulnerable individuals in remote rural areas. The store employee, testifying under subpoena, recalled multiple occasions when Elijah had visited with one or more of the children, noting that their physical similarities were so pronounced that customers often commented on them after the family left. "We all thought it was strange," the employee testified, "but mountain families tend to be close-knit, and we figured it was just strong family genes." Nobody wanted to be the one to suggest something improper was going on. After 2 weeks of testimony that laid bare the complex web of isolation, manipulation, and institutional failure that had enabled the situation to continue for over a decade, the jury deliberated for nearly 6 hours before reaching their verdict. They found Elijah Shelton guilty of incest but recommended leniency due to the extraordinary mitigating circumstances of his upbringing and psychological condition. Judge Elena Simmons, in pronouncing sentence, struggled to balance justice with recognition of the unique factors that had contributed to the case. She sentenced Elijah to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months and ordered mandatory psychological treatment both during incarceration and following release. In her final statement before passing sentence, Judge Simmons delivered words that would be quoted in legal journals and social work textbooks for decades to come. This case represents a collective failure, not only of the defendant, who must still be held responsible for his actions, but of a society that allowed an entire family to fall through the cracks of our protection and support systems. Geographic isolation must never be allowed to become institutional abandonment. We have a responsibility to ensure that no family, no matter how remote or resistant to outside contact, becomes so isolated that basic human decency and the protection of children becomes secondary to misguided concepts of family. Autonomy. The question of what to do with the 3 children proved equally complex and emotionally fraught. The court ordered them to remain temporarily in state custody, while Martha received intensive psychological treatment and evaluation to determine her capacity to provide proper care. The ultimate goal, supported by child welfare experts who had evaluated the case, was family reunification, since Martha had demonstrated genuine love for her children and appeared capable of proper parenting once freed from Elijah's psychological control and provided with appropriate support and education. The children were placed in a carefully selected foster home in neighboring Texas County, where they began the long process of adaptation to life in the outside world. Thomas, the eldest at 12, demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability, quickly adjusting to formal schooling and rapidly catching up with his peers academically despite having received no formal education prior to his placement. His intelligence and eagerness to learn impressed his teachers and social workers, though he continued to struggle with social interactions and displayed signs of anxiety when separated from his siblings. Sadie faced more significant challenges in adapting to her new environment, particularly in social situations where her sheltered upbringing and lack of experience with other children became apparent. However, she responded well to medical treatment for her strabismus and other health problems, and with patient support from her foster family and teachers, began to develop age-appropriate social skills. Her artistic talents, perhaps inherited from generations of mountain craftspeople, became evident as she learned to express her experiences and emotions through drawing and painting. Jacob, the youngest and most severely affected by the genetic consequences of his parents' relationship, required the most intensive support and medical intervention. Comprehensive genetic testing confirmed that he suffered from Apert syndrome, a rare genetic condition characterized by skull and facial malformations and abnormalities in the hands and feet. While this condition can occur spontaneously in any family, its incidence is significantly higher in cases of close consanguinity, and Jacob's case was particularly severe due to the multiple generations of inbreeding in his family line. Jacob underwent several surgeries to correct the most serious malformations and began intensive therapy to address his developmental delays. Though his progress was slower than that of his siblings, he showed remarkable spirit and determination, gradually developing communication skills and learning to navigate the world despite his physical and cognitive limitations. His foster family, specially selected for their experience with special needs children, provided the patience and specialized care that Jacob required. Comprehensive genetic counseling and testing revealed that all 3 children carried multiple genetic variants resulting from their parents. Consanguineous relationship. Thomas, despite his apparent normalcy, carried genetic markers that predisposed him to certain autoimmune conditions and metabolic disorders. Though with proper medical monitoring and care, these risks could be managed effectively. Sadie's genetic profile revealed more significant concerns, including a rare enzymatic deficiency that affected her metabolism and required ongoing medication and dietary management. Jacob's condition was the most complex, with multiple genetic abnormalities that would require lifelong medical care and support. The Shelton case became a catalyst for significant changes in child protection policies in Missouri and several neighboring states. The revelations of institutional failure and the tragic consequences of allowing families to become completely isolated from social services prompted a comprehensive review of procedures for monitoring vulnerable populations in rural areas. The result was the passage of the Shelton Act by the Missouri State Legislature in 1985, which established more rigorous protocols for identifying and assisting isolated families, including mandatory wellness checks for all children, regardless of whether formal complaints had been filed. The law also provided additional funding for social services in rural counties and established specialized training programs for social workers dealing with isolated communities. Perhaps most importantly, it created a statewide database for tracking families who might be at risk due to geographic isolation, religious extremism, or other factors that could lead to the kind of systematic neglect and abuse that the Shelton children had experienced. Elijah Shelton served 22 months of his sentence before being released on parole in early 1985. As conditions of his release, he was permanently prohibited from returning to the family property while the children remained in Martha's care, was required to undergo continued psychological treatment, and was subject to regular supervision by parole officers. He was also required to maintain employment and stable housing, a requirement that proved challenging given his complete lack of formal education or job skills. Upon his release, Elijah moved to a small apartment in Springfield, where he found work as a maintenance worker for a local church that had agreed to sponsor his reintegration into society. His adjustment to life in the outside world was difficult and marked by periods of severe depression and anxiety. The psychological treatment he received focused on helping him understand the wrongness of his actions and develop healthier concepts of family relationships and social norms. Progress was slow, and Elijah struggled with persistent delusions about the superiority of his family line and the corruption of modern society. Martha's rehabilitation proved more successful, though it was a lengthy and emotionally challenging process. After 2 years of intensive psychological treatment, including individual therapy, group counseling, and extensive education about normal family relationships and child development, she was deemed capable of resuming custody of her children. In 1984, with substantial state assistance, Martha moved to a small house on the outskirts of West Plains, where the children could continue their education and receive ongoing medical care while being gradually reintegrated into their mother's care. The transition was not without challenges. Martha had to learn basic skills that most adults take for granted: how to budget and manage household finances, how to interact with teachers and medical professionals, how to navigate bureaucratic systems, and how to provide guidance and discipline for her children in appropriate ways. She also had to overcome years of psychological conditioning that had taught her to fear and distrust the outside world. With the support of dedicated social workers, therapists, and community volunteers, Martha slowly began to build a new life for herself and her children. She completed her GED and eventually found employment as a library assistant, a job that suited her quiet nature and love of learning. Though she remained somewhat socially awkward and preferred to keep to herself, she developed into a capable and loving mother who was determined to give her children the opportunities and normal life that had been denied to her. The children's stories continued to evolve in remarkable ways over the subsequent decades. Thomas, driven perhaps by his own experiences, pursued higher education with the support of state programs and private scholarships established specifically to help children who had been removed from abusive situations. He graduated from college with a degree in social work and dedicated his career to helping children in vulnerable situations, eventually becoming a supervisor in the same Missouri Department of Social Services that had rescued him from his isolated childhood. Thomas never forgot his origins, and his unique perspective as someone who had experienced extreme isolation and institutional intervention made him particularly effective in reaching children from similar backgrounds. He married a fellow social worker he met during his training, and together they adopted 2 children who had been removed from abusive homes. Though Thomas carried genetic markers that could have been passed to biological children, he and his wife made the deliberate choice to build their family through adoption, feeling called to provide homes for children who might otherwise remain in the foster care system. Sadie's path was more challenging, but equally inspiring in its own way. She continued to struggle with the social and psychological effects of her early experiences, finding it difficult to form close relationships and battling periods of depression and anxiety throughout her adolescence and early adulthood. However, she found solace and expression through art, developing considerable talent as a painter and craftsperson. Her work, often inspired by the natural beauty of the Ozark Hills, where she had spent her early years, gained recognition in regional art circles. Though Sadie never married or had children of her own, a conscious choice influenced by her genetic history and lingering trust issues, she found fulfillment in teaching art to children and adults through community programs. Her gentle nature An intuitive understanding of trauma made her particularly effective in working with students who had experienced difficult life circumstances. Through her art and teaching, she was able to transform her painful experiences into something healing and beautiful. Jacob's journey was perhaps the most remarkable of all, given the severity of his medical and developmental challenges. Though his Apert syndrome and other genetic conditions required ongoing medical care and would limit his independence throughout his life, Jacob demonstrated an indomitable spirit and a capacity for joy that inspired everyone who worked with him. Despite his cognitive limitations, he possessed an intuitive understanding of people and emotions that made him beloved by his caregivers, teachers, and the broader community that embraced him. As Jacob grew into adulthood, he achieved a level of semi-independent living that many medical professionals had thought impossible given the severity of his conditions. With the support of disability services and a network of community volunteers, he was able to live in a supervised group home while working part-time in various community service roles. His gentle nature and genuine desire to help others made him particularly suited to work with elderly residents at a local nursing home, where his presence brought comfort and joy to people facing their own health challenges. Perhaps most remarkably, Jacob became an advocate for disability rights in rural communities, speaking at conferences and legislative hearings about the importance of ensuring that people with disabilities in remote areas have access to the same services and opportunities as those in urban centers. His simple, heartfelt testimony about his own experiences proved more powerful than any expert analysis in convincing lawmakers to expand funding and services for rural disability programs. The Shelton case became required study material in social work programs, law schools, and medical schools across the country, serving as a complex example of how geographic isolation, generational trauma, genetic factors, and institutional failures can combine to create tragic situations that might have been prevented with proper intervention and support systems. The case study was particularly valuable because it demonstrated both the devastating consequences of institutional neglect and the remarkable potential for healing and recovery when appropriate resources and support are provided. Academic researchers continued to study the family for decades, not as subjects of curiosity, but as participants in ongoing research aimed at better understanding the long-term effects of extreme isolation and inbreeding, as well as the most effective interventions for helping survivors of such situations. The family members, particularly Thomas in his role as a social worker, became willing participants in this research, understanding that their experiences could help prevent similar tragedies and improve services for other vulnerable families. In 2002, 20 years after the initial discovery of the family situation, Margaret Wilson, by then retired after a distinguished career in social services, reflected on the case in an extensive interview with a regional newspaper. Her words captured both the horror of what had been discovered and the hope represented by the family's recovery. What strikes me most when I look back is how something so extreme could happen practically in plain sight. This wasn't a cabin hidden in some inaccessible wilderness. It was less than 30 kilometers from a county seat, in a state with resources and institutions supposedly capable of protecting vulnerable people. It forces us to confront how many other similar situations might exist, hidden in remote valleys or hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to pay attention and care enough to intervene. Margaret's reflection highlighted one of the most troubling aspects of the case: the realization that the Shelton family's isolation had been largely self-imposed and enabled by a community and institutional structure that was willing to look the other way, as long as the family wasn't obviously causing problems for others. The case prompted difficult conversations about the balance between respecting family autonomy and privacy versus ensuring the protection of vulnerable individuals, particularly children. The investigation also revealed disturbing patterns of willful blindness on the part of various community members and institutions. Store clerks, postal workers, occasional visitors, and even some local officials had noticed signs that should have prompted questions. The unusual physical similarities among family members, the children's obvious lack of medical care and education, the family's extreme isolation, and Martha's mysterious pregnancies, but had chosen not to pursue their concerns out of a misguided respect for privacy or a desire to avoid involvement in what might be a complicated situation. The case became a powerful argument for the principle that child protection must sometimes override concerns about family privacy and autonomy. As Judge Simmons had noted in her sentencing statement, geographic isolation could never be allowed to become an excuse for institutional abandonment of vulnerable individuals. The Shelton children's recovery and eventual success in life demonstrated that even the most damaged individuals could heal and thrive when provided with appropriate support and opportunities. Elijah's story took a different trajectory. Despite years of psychological treatment and attempts at rehabilitation, he never fully adjusted to life in mainstream society. His deep-seated beliefs about family purity and the corruption of the outside world proved remarkably resistant to change, even when confronted with clear evidence of the harm his actions had caused his children and sister. He continued to work in menial jobs and lived in modest circumstances, but remained isolated and suspicious of others. In 1995, 10 years after his release from prison, Elijah was found dead in his small apartment, apparently from natural causes related to undiagnosed heart problems. His death went largely unnoticed, except by his parole officer and a few church members who had tried unsuccessfully to help him integrate into their community. At his funeral, attended only by a handful of people, Reverend Miller, now elderly but still active in ministry, delivered a eulogy that captured the tragedy of a life shaped by isolation and twisted beliefs. Elijah Shelton was both perpetrator and victim, a man whose terrible actions cannot be excused, but whose life story reminds us of the importance of community, education, and the danger of allowing anyone to become so isolated from human society that they lose touch with basic moral principles. We pray for his soul, and we commit ourselves to ensuring that other children do not grow up as he did, cut off from the broader human family that might have taught him different ways of living and loving. The original Shelton property, abandoned since the family's removal in 1982, gradually fell into ruin. The cabin that had sheltered generations of the family slowly succumbed to weather and time, its roof collapsing under the weight of snow and rain, its walls rotting and returning to the earth from which they had been built. The vegetable garden became overgrown with weeds and wild plants, and the well filled with debris and became unsafe. In 1990, the state sold the property at auction to cover unpaid taxes and legal costs associated with the case. The buyer, a developer from Springfield, initially planned to clear the land and build a small recreational cabin, but after learning the property's history, decided instead to donate it to the State Conservation Department. The land became part of a larger wilderness preserve, ensuring that it would remain undeveloped and serve as a quiet memorial to the family that had lived there in such tragic isolation. Local residents, particularly older ones who remembered the Shelton family, continued to speak in hushed tones about the case for years afterward. Some expressed sympathy for Elijah and Martha, viewing them as victims of circumstances beyond their control, who had been unfairly persecuted by outside authorities who didn't understand mountain ways. Others felt that the intervention had come far too late, and that the community bore collective responsibility for allowing the situation to continue for so long without proper investigation or support. The case also sparked broader discussions about the role of government in rural communities and the tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility for protecting vulnerable members of society. Some libertarian critics argued that the Shelton case was being used to justify excessive government intrusion into family life and that people should have the right to live according to their own values, even if those values seemed strange or troubling to outsiders. However, these arguments were consistently countered by child welfare advocates who pointed out that the children in the case had never chosen their circumstances and had been denied basic rights to education, medical care, and protection from harm. The case became a powerful example of why child protection laws exist and why society has both the right and the obligation to intervene when children are being harmed, regardless of the justifications offered by their parents or guardians. In the years following the case, several academic studies examined the long-term outcomes for children removed from similar situations of extreme isolation and abuse. The Shelton children, with their permission and participation, became part of these longitudinal studies, providing valuable data about resilience, recovery, and the effectiveness of different intervention strategies. The research consistently showed that early intervention and comprehensive support services were crucial for positive outcomes. Children who received immediate medical care, educational support, psychological counseling, and stable placements were much more likely to overcome their early disadvantages and achieve successful adult lives than those who were returned to their original environments without adequate support or those who experienced multiple placement disruptions. The Shelton case also contributed to important changes in how genetic counseling services were provided to families affected by inbreeding. The children's medical experiences highlighted the need for specialized genetic counseling that could address not only the medical implications of consanguineous relationships, but also the psychological and social factors that often contributed to such situations. Dr. Brennan, the genetic specialist who had first identified the extent of Jacob's genetic problems, continued to follow the family's medical progress for decades. His research on the genetic consequences of inbreeding in isolated populations contributed to better understanding of how such genetic problems could be prevented and treated. More importantly, his work emphasized the crucial role that early intervention and comprehensive medical care could play in minimizing the long-term effects of genetic disorders. Martha's transformation over the years following the case remained one of its most hopeful aspects. From a frightened, isolated woman who had been completely dominated by her brother's twisted worldview, she gradually developed into a confident, caring mother who was determined to give her children every opportunity for normal, healthy lives. Her quiet strength and determination became an inspiration to social workers and therapists who worked with other victims of long-term psychological abuse. Martha never remarried, partly due to the psychological scars from her experiences, and partly due to her complete devotion to raising her children and helping them overcome their early disadvantages. She became active in support groups for survivors of family abuse and occasionally spoke at training sessions for social workers and law enforcement officers, sharing her insights about the gradual process of psychological manipulation that had led to her situation. Her testimony at these training sessions was particularly valuable because she could articulate the internal experience of someone who had been systematically isolated and indoctrinated. She helped professionals understand how victims of such manipulation might appear to be willing participants in their own abuse, when in reality, they had been gradually stripped of their ability to think independently or imagine alternatives to their situation. People ask me how I could have let this happen, Martha would say during these presentations, her voice quiet but steady. They want to know why I didn't resist, why I didn't seek help, why I didn't protect my children better. What they don't understand is that by the time the worst things started happening, I was no longer capable of thinking clearly about what was normal or right. I had been isolated from any other perspective for so long that Elijah's words became my only reality. Recovery wasn't just about learning new information, it was about remembering how to think for myself again. The community of Current River, the small town that had served as the Shelton's only connection to the outside world, also underwent a process of reflection and change following the case. Town meetings were held to discuss how similar situations might be identified and addressed in the future, and local businesses developed informal protocols for reporting concerns about isolated families or individuals who might be in need of assistance. The general store where Elijah had occasionally purchased supplies became a focal point for these discussions, with employees receiving training on recognizing signs of abuse or neglect and understanding their role as potential first contacts for isolated families. The store owner, deeply troubled by the realization that his business had been one of the few places where the family's problems might have been identified and addressed earlier, became a strong advocate for community awareness and intervention programs. Local churches, which had traditionally respected family privacy and avoided interfering in domestic situations, also re-examined their role in protecting vulnerable community members. Several congregations developed outreach programs specifically designed to maintain contact with isolated families and provide support before problems reached crisis levels. The case also had lasting effects on the legal and social service systems in Missouri and neighboring states. Training programs for social workers began including extensive components on identifying and working with extremely isolated families, and new protocols were established for conducting investigations in rural areas where traditional social service models might not be effective. Law enforcement agencies also updated their training to help officers recognize signs of long-term isolation and abuse that might not fit typical patterns. The unique challenges presented by the Shelton case, where the victims were simultaneously unaware of their victimization and protective of their abuser, required new approaches to investigation and intervention that balanced respect for family autonomy with protection of vulnerable individuals. As the children reached adulthood and began to establish their own families and careers, they maintained close relationships with each other despite their different paths in life. Their shared experiences, both traumatic and hopeful, created bonds that remained strong throughout their lives. They gathered annually on the anniversary of their removal from the mountain cabin, not to dwell on their painful past, but to celebrate their survival and success. These annual gatherings became opportunities for the siblings to reflect on their journey and to support each other through ongoing challenges related to their unusual childhood. They also served as informal research sessions as all three siblings continued to participate in long-term studies designed to better understand the effects of extreme isolation and the factors that contributed to successful recovery. Thomas, in his role as a social worker, often drew on his personal experiences when working with children from similar backgrounds. His unique perspective, as someone who had lived through extreme isolation and successful intervention, gave him credibility and insight that proved invaluable in helping other families navigate the complex process of integration into mainstream society. Sadie's art continued to evolve and mature, with her paintings and sculptures gaining recognition beyond the regional art community. Several of her works were acquired by museums as part of collections focused on art, created by survivors of trauma and abuse. Her artistic success provided not only personal fulfillment but also a platform for raising awareness about the ongoing effects of childhood trauma and the importance of support services for survivors. Jacob's advocacy work expanded over the years, as he became increasingly articulate and confident in speaking about disability rights and the special challenges faced by people with disabilities in rural areas. His presentations at conferences and legislative hearings carried particular weight because of his personal experience and his obvious determination to overcome significant obstacles. The three siblings also became involved in mentoring other children who had been removed from isolated or abusive situations, providing peer support that complemented the professional services available through state and private agencies. Their success stories served as powerful examples of the potential for recovery and growth, even in cases that initially seemed hopeless. The Shelton case ultimately stood as both a warning and a source of hope. A warning about the devastating consequences of allowing vulnerable individuals to become completely isolated from society's protective systems, and a source of hope about the human capacity for healing and growth when appropriate support and opportunities are provided. The family story continued to inform policy discussions, professional training, and community awareness efforts decades after the initial discovery of their situation. In retrospect, the case highlighted several crucial principles that became fundamental to modern child protection practice. The need for multiple reporting mechanisms to ensure that concerns about vulnerable individuals don't go unaddressed, the crucial role of early intervention in preventing small problems from becoming major tragedies, and the remarkable potential for recovery and growth that exists even in the most damaged individuals when they receive appropriate support and care. The Shelton family story ultimately lives and breaks cycles of isolation and abuse that might otherwise continue for generations. Their journey from the isolated mountain cabin to successful integration into society demonstrated that with proper support, even the most challenging circumstances could be overcome, and that the investment in protecting and nurturing vulnerable children would yield benefits not just for those individuals, but for society as a whole.